It's 4 o'clock on the dot. I want to welcome everybody to the community conversation. Welcome into the community conversation about A Boy and His Soul. I am Marcus Fisher. I'm a board director with Pandora Productions, which the people that are with us and the subscribers know that it is the theater company that exclusively is dedicated to telling stories of the LGBTQ plus community. And today we're going to have a conversation around A Boy and His Soul. Hopefully, it's kind of like in college or in grade school. Hopefully, you've already done your homework and you watched the show because we're going to be having some spoilers. So if you haven't watched the show, then you might want to wait till next week because we are recording this and it will be shown again next week. So we're going to dive into a lot of themes and ask a lot of questions and talk about the show itself. Right now, I want to introduce you to the moderator for today, which is going to be Janelle Rae. Janelle Rae is the Dean of Students at Spalding University, which provides vision and direction to the Student Development and Campus Life Department, which includes housing, counseling, student leadership, service, campus activities, and student health. Janelle serves on the board of directors at Pandora Productions here, and also the Big Table, a giant community potluck designed to bring people together across culture and food, and founding member of the Synergy Project with Lean Into Louisville, an initiative that brings police officers and the community together and facilitate a conversation on how to improve their relationships with each other. That's a much needed effort right there. Janelle holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Leadership Studies and a Master of Social Work degree. She is currently, which I'm most proud of, she is currently pursuing her doctorate of education in leadership at Spalding University. So without further ado, I'm going to leave it over to my Oprah, the moderator of today, Janelle Rae. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Marcus said that when he invited me to moderate this panel, he said, I'd like you to consider being Oprah for a day. And I said, well, she is my big icon. I've never met her, but my goodness, if I could try to be a little bit like Oprah, I would, what a dream for me. So I'm so happy you're all here to join us. Welcome, everyone. I've been a member of the Pandora Productions family for a little over a decade now. And I've just found it to be a warm and welcoming, inviting place. And Pandora's vision is to foster profound relatedness and belonging by and for our diverse community. We aim to provide entertaining, engaging, enlightening material that sparks the imagination and reinforces a sense of community. And I think we found all of that here in this show, A Boy and His Soul. So I'm really excited to welcome our panelists and engage in some conversation. They've all had a chance to see the show. We've got actually the star of the show with us as well. So I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about his process and how this show sort of stirred all of us. For our audience, when it comes time for the question and answer portion, which we'll get to a little bit later in the panel, in the conversation, if you would like to ask a question on video, I invite you to raise your hand. So not on video, but there's a raise your hand function in the Zoom platform. Different devices have it in different places. It might be at the very bottom of your screen. It might be in the participants list. I think the old version of Zoom, you'd have to open up the participants list and you could see your reactions. But if you've updated Zoom recently, it's now in the should be at the very bottom of your screen. Just raise your hand. What we'll do is we'll put you on video so you can say hello to the panelists and ask your question directly. If you're a little camera shy and would rather ask your question off camera or have your question asked for you, you could just put that in the chat and I'll ask your question on your behalf. So again, when it comes time, I'll review that order when we get to the Q&A, but be thinking now whether or not you'd like to ask your question on camera or not. So I do want to introduce our panel. I mentioned that we have the star of the show, Tony Smith, who has been performing on Louisville stages for the better part of 20 years. I find that hard. He must have started when he was a child, a very young child. He is a graduate of the Youth Performing Arts School, has gone on to perform with 4 national touring productions through AFT, based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And since then, he has performed with Stage One, Derby Dinner Playhouse, Actors Theater, as well as choreographed and directed numerous productions with the Alley Theater and the Bardstown Theater. His first production with Pandora was the 2018 staging of Altar Boys, the musical, and he's very excited to return to Pandora, and we're very happy to have him. And you all might be surprised to learn that this was Tony's very first one-man show. And so I know I'm assuming everyone who's watching this video has seen the show and is probably really blown away by the fact that this was his first time carrying a show completely on his shoulders. He did a super fantastic job, and I'm excited to learn more about how he was able to prepare for that. Also with us today is Anitra Durand-Allen. She says, say what you really mean to the people in your life that matter the most. It's the motto by which she lives her life. As a certified Christian life coach and student therapist in marriage and family therapy, Anitra's goal is to help others identify and break down the barriers that stand in the way of enjoying their lives and families, primarily those in the Black community. Anitra is also a classically trained vocalist and avid supporter of the arts. As the mother of a professional performer, she knows and embraces the value of arts education and exposure. She shares her experience managing the challenges of supporting high-achieving teens on her blog, The Mom on the Move. Anitra is a wife and mother of 3 teens and resides in Louisville. And I just recently learned Anitra's sort of title is Creator and Chief Mom at The Mom on the Move, which I just think is fantastic. Chief Mom, I love that. I think it's a fabulous title. So welcome, Anitra. We're really happy to have you. And our other panelist today is Shameka Sells-Moore, who hails from the Carolinas and has been living in Kentucky for the past 12 years. She lives in Hardin County with her wife, Lisa. When she's not spending time with her children and grandchildren, she loves decorating, traveling with her wife, and trying small town restaurants. Shameka is a licensed therapist where she has several independent contracts and is the owner of ALI Counseling Services Incorporated. She is also an adjunct professor at Indiana University Southeast, and I'm wondering if she ever has time to sleep. Shameka received a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Indiana University Southeast, a Master of Education in Counseling and Human Development from Lindsey Wilson College, and she is currently all but defended ABD with a doctorate in philosophy and counselor education and supervision, where she is patiently waiting to defend her dissertation. Welcome to the future, Dr. Sells-Moore. So glad that you could join us. I feel your pain. I'm not quite as far along as you are, Shameka, but I have great respect for where you are in your process. So thank you all so much for joining us for the conversation today. So I think we all had a chance. So I just watched the show this morning, and what a delight. It was so fun. I had it was a great way to start my morning with all that beautiful music, as well as the wonderful acting from Tony. But I was hoping perhaps we could go around and perhaps you could just share your general overall thoughts about the play and what struck you about JJ's story. So I'm gonna start with you, Tony, the star of the play. What was struck you about JJ's story?
Well, it's funny. When I first got the script, I looked at everything that had to do with the music. And I'm a little bit younger, so I grew up in the 90s. And the first thing that I did was just tried to actually translate this to what I felt when it came to the music in my house, which when it came to R&B, it was more Boyz II Men and stuff like that. And then it was a huge hip hop house. So I kind of translated it that way. And as far as all the impressions and all of his family members, I have a pretty big family too. And I also grew up north. I grew up in Northern Ohio and didn't move here until I was 15. So the whole move down south actually made a lot of sense for me. And we definitely didn't have a lot of money growing up either. So I understood the poor aspect as well. And I mean, I kind of just took it bit by bit and used each scene as a different experience, but also tried to translate that to some of the people in my life. More specifically, the sister is a lot like my older sister. And that's, I mean, almost I kind of just heard her voice as I was reading the play anytime that the sister actually came up. And yeah, I just kind of took it bit by bit the entire time, just like really relating it to my life. But I mean, I love the story and the aspect of having to come out to a very religious family, come out of the closet, come out as gay. That is one thing that I actually didn't have experience with. So that one I really did need to go and kind of research a little bit. How would this be? Because I personally am not a gay man, but I can imagine that it would be much, much harder to do that back in the 70s and 80s, 90s. Whew. I mean, because of course things are so much, you know, a little bit more open nowadays, but doing it back then, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm sure that was ridiculously hard. So yeah, it was a challenge, but this is, as you mentioned, this is my first one-man show. I've never done this before, so it was definitely a huge experience. I loved it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I do hope to talk a little bit later, perhaps, about the experience of JJ coming out to his religious family and perhaps some surprises. Certainly some surprises there for me in watching that story evolve. But Anitra, what struck you about JJ's story, and what, if anything, do you think the playwright Colman Domingo was trying to convey through this piece of art?
Yeah, so the first thought that I had in response to what Tony shared is whether or not Avery dyed her red braids with Kool-Aid, because I am a child of the 80s and remember my sister dyeing her hair with Kool-Aid and wondering how my mom was going to respond that she used up all the Kool-Aid to dye her hair. However, what really stuck out for me is, you know, as Marcus kind of said before we started, as a performer myself, I often have to separate observing the art from receiving the message, which, you know, are usually pretty well intertwined. And what I picked up from A Boy and His Soul and JJ's story and how it parallels Colman Domingo's own story is this notion that goes back decades to the W.E. Du Bois concept of double consciousness. And where he was presenting it from a perspective of being both Black and American at the same time as opposing identities. What I picked up was themes, many other themes, being Black and gay at the same time as opposing identities, being Black and cultured at the same time as opposing identities, being Black and whatever you fill in the blank of the core values and beliefs of your own family and community that for whatever reason oppose the identity of Blackness. And that's kind of what I picked up throughout the show. And it was amazingly well intertwined into the message that I wonder if those who don't have that experience of being Black and quote unquote other could even pick that message up. Or to see it, because there were times when I was like, oh man, yeah, yep, I felt that in my soul, you know, as it were, to the point that it's almost kind of the invisible struggles that we go through coming into the knowledge of our true selves. And I think that the show was written very well to represent those things. And I think Tony did a phenomenal job presenting that.
Shameka, what struck you about JJ's story and what Colman was trying to portray through this piece of art?
Well, I think the first thing was that my first thought was, this is me. This is my family. I had an Uncle Jerome. I had a very gay, flamboyant cousin, Cypherdine. I had a Cypherdine that everyone was just kind of like, stay away. And it also struck me that about the neighborhood changes. The neighborhood that I grew up in, my dad still lives there, but it is not the same. It was at one point working class Black families, and now it's like you have to armor up to even go there. Like just the changes, just going from the north to the south. Like we traveled up the East Coast a lot with family, and Sundays being for gospel, that struck me too. Like, you know, my grandmother owned a liquor house. And so she was a bootlegger. And so Monday through Saturday, it was all of this music. I'm a 70s baby. But then on Sunday, it was something completely different. And we got hallelujah-fied on Sundays. So I definitely connected with that one. And I think my overall takeaway from this was that family is just family. And that at the end of everything, particularly at the end of life, you look back on those things and you connect with the things that made you who you are. And in this case, it was music. I remember being so connected to music. Now, even when I'm driving in my car and something particular comes on, I can turn up the music and I can go back to 1982. I can go back to certain moments in my life. And I really think that this was, this conveyed that beautifully.
Yeah, definitely. I think the use of music as a construct or a tool to engage the audience, particularly since we as humans can often associate great memories or moments or feelings or emotions through music. That was really brilliant on Colman's part. Anitra, you mentioned double consciousness, which I think is a really important piece to pick up, is just recognizing that JJ was, he actually had a lot of identities that we saw intersected. And something that was really interesting to me was how Colman was able to fit all of that information in a pretty short play. It was just a little over an hour long, but you know, he is gay, he is Black, he's growing up in the 80s to 90s. He's got a stepfather. And he's also learning about, he's sort of struggling a little bit with his own identity, as you mentioned, sort of cultured, what that looks like, which I picked up on, you know, his mother perhaps being kind of something that his mother was impressing upon him in terms of her own wishes and dreams. Can you talk to us a little bit more about sort of that part of identity development, and perhaps even more specifically about Black identity development when it comes to double consciousness?
Yeah, absolutely. As a student in marriage and family therapy, we learn all of, you know, these different approaches to system theory. And one of the ones that I have gravitated toward, it's called Bowen theory. Long story short, your family is a primary vehicle through how your core values and beliefs are formed, like what it is that you know, whether it is implicitly taught or explicitly, you know, instilled in you. And when we come to these processes of identity formation, especially when we're coming to a point of struggling with accepting, acknowledging, or living into our identity, for me, I believe it comes from a place where what we know emotionally conflicts with what we know cognitively conflicts with what we feel emotionally, where those core values that we've gotten from our family, you know, that be a man and that means don't be gay, or at least don't act like you're gay. When we come to the conflict of those things is where those are the points where identity formation really have an opportunity to grow and to flourish if we are able to lean into them, and if we're able to acknowledge, you know what, my family loves me and they meant well, but this no longer serves me. And because it no longer serves me, I can still live into this identity and be a part of this family. And those two opposing things can exist at the same time. And that takes a while for some people to get to. And it's not an easy thing to, face, because what your core value or that core thing that you know beyond knowing is being challenged in a way that you've not been actually prepared to face. And I think that that comes to light in this show in a number of different ways, especially in the strip club scene. That was one of those moments where JJ was like, okay, I can't do this no more. Like, I'm gonna have to roll with it because this ain't working.
Yeah, I found that I was almost not entirely surprised, but a little surprised. Like it took a while for us to really find out for sure that JJ was in fact gay. He talked earlier in his childhood about struggling to talk to girls, and there was certainly a lot of queer coding early on in the play too. A lot of references. I think the use of the word like soft or funny, or all of those things were kind of talked about and talked around, but nothing was ever directly said. And it took us, getting to his 21st birthday to really find out for sure. Did you all were you surprised at all? Did you see it coming? How did you feel about the way that Colman handled that part of JJ's identity coming to the forefront? And since you mentioned specifically the strip club scene, what was your reaction to his family's reaction to him coming out? So I'll start with Shameka.
I was very surprised by the family's reaction because in that era, it was not as, people weren't as open, people were not as accepting, particularly when you come from a strong Black family, because even though there was not a lot of talk about being religious or religion, there's still that core that Anitra just talked about. And at the other end of that core, there was, you just don't do that. It's not something that you did. I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in the Carolinas, and it was, he said something about, I rebelled against soul music, and that I really thought about that. And I can remember rebelling against LL Cool J because all of the other girls around me found him hot and I found him repulsive. I liked MC Light. So him showing, his family saying, you know what, it's cool, it's good. And his sister very much being in her character was like, I'm not upset because you're gay. I'm upset because you didn't tell me first. Like, what's that all about? I was very surprised. I was pleasantly surprised because during that time, it just really didn't go that way.
And I think, I'm just gonna say, to Shameka's point, I think Colman did a phenomenal job of demonstrating the change in perspective over time. Because early in the play, when the parents are addressing the issues, it's very, as Shameka said, you just don't do that. We don't even talk about it. It's hush hush. You sweep that under the rug. And then as the time progresses and as societal views about identity development begin to become more inclusive, the family's perspective shifts with that. And I thought that was a great demonstration of how we can change with the time, even though many times that actually doesn't occur.
Really. Tony, do you have any thoughts on?
I'm sorry. There's also the
how gay
are you? Like, how gay are you? Are you wearing scarves kind of gay?
Because right, exactly.
But if you're friend and you love them, love is love, that's fine. But if you mess it up, I don't think we're gonna be okay with that. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that there was that, I too was surprised by their acceptance and their openness, but there's still a limit there, right? There's some, we're okay with it as long as it's not too obvious or not too, not like the cousin. Sorry, go ahead, Tony.
Right, yeah, and the funny thing, the relative that I was most surprised about just reading through it the first time was Rick, the brother. I thought he was actually going to be the one that was maybe not okay with this. Because, I mean, even earlier in the play, like, he drops the F-bomb, the bad one, and I'm like, okay, this is probably not going to turn out as well as we're hoping, and he was surprisingly even more open than anyone would think. And the only way that I kind of saw that with my family, honestly, now, of course, things are a little bit more open, so I found out about more family members that are part of the LGBTQ community, but I never would have known that when I was a kid. I didn't find out until I was an adult. That's when they actually started to come out and started to talk to the family about it. And so, I mean, one of my cousins, a very close cousin, she basically probably had that almost exact same situation happen to her. And that's how the whole family found out, because she felt more comfortable with it. And I loved Rick's response in the show. And I mean, just the idea that he was, he'd grown, of course, as a kid, he was like that tough boy, but it's his brother. He loves him. And he's like, you know what? Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. And I'm glad that you feel comfortable enough with me to tell me that. Like, this is great. So yeah, I mean, that was one of my favorite moments of the entire show.
Yeah, I think you making that reference to sort of what you came to know as an adult reminds me of what Colman was saying. He gave JJ the line of like looking at things through adult eyes, right? How he's just like, oh, now I understand what that song means. Or and Anitra, you talked about just sort of this was a little bit reflective of the changing of the times, but also I think just perhaps the wisdom and the flexibility and the openness that comes with age, just as part of our development as human beings, is that perhaps we get a little bit more focus on what really matters, right? So for me, the show was really a reminder of like, even though Colman gave us all these signals to think that the family wouldn't respond very well to this information, right. Ultimately what he was leaning into is like that this is family, right? These are people who have chosen to be in, especially knowing that, you know, Pops is the stepdad, but people who've chosen to be in family together and choose to really love each other. And that's really ultimately what matters to them. Mm-hmm. It's really good. I'm curious what your thoughts are. You know, JJ was sort of going through the records in the basement and having sort of this nostalgia moment, knowing that the parents had long left that area of time. And then when he went to go visit them in Virginia and dealing with the illnesses of his parents, how do you think grief affects how we view the past, and perhaps even how we view our family dynamics? Anybody can take that one on.
Well, I think that I've become, sadly and very unfortunately, I've become an expert on this over the past couple of years. In 2017, I lost my 4-year-old grandson, and I'm sorry, in 2018, and in 2019, I lost my 25-year-old daughter. And then just this past October, I lost my mom. So I can honestly say that whenever you go back to the smallest places, you are affected in a way that you're taken back to those moments where they are still there. I recently visited an apartment building that we lived in North Carolina when I went home, and we hadn't been there in years. And any time that I would pass by it before now, it wouldn't be a big deal. But passing by it, knowing that my daughter was 8 years old when we lived there, I was immediately taken back to her being in that space when she was 8 years old and everything that went along with it. So it is, grief is one of those things that just kind of shows up most of the time in places where you just don't expect it. And I think that, again, a brilliant job of displaying that. I could really, I could understand everything in that part.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too often we don't give ourselves and others enough opportunity or permission to grieve the losses that are not connected to death. And so leaving the home, you know, it no longer being a part of the family. I had a very similar experience in my own family where we had to sell the house that my great grandmother lived in, that I went to every day after school, where all of my formative years were developed, where we had the entire family from my great grandmother down came for dinner on Sunday afternoons, where we went and spent the night when my parents had to travel for work, and it was a very real emotional loss, even though it wasn't a death. And I think that the grief that comes from the losses that aren't death are very present in this story. We don't give enough permission for people to grieve changes in situations, places, and relationships as well. And there's a grief that comes from what you once thought is no longer. They call it, you know, the loss of the assumptive world. The way that you thought the world worked has all been swept from underneath you and the rug pulled from underneath your feet. And there's nothing tangible to kind of hold on to that, to say, okay, this is grief. But for those families who, you know, have held this perspective that JJ is this, and now that JJ says, no, I'm not really that, I'm this, they have a loss of what they thought the world was. And the challenge that I face with some of my clients in this space, especially those who are facing coming out as LGBTQ, is their loss lies in direct contradiction to who I am. And that's something very difficult to resolve, that they feel a loss about what makes me feel alive. But I think, for this particular show, that Colman does a really great job of highlighting both the process of grief from the loss of things that aren't death, and then how that can translate over into the law or the grief that you experience from losses that are death as well.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I was intrigued by the choice and the use of music. In some ways, we hear JJ talk about kind of the music he was attracted to as a younger boy when he was playing the violin, and during the actual play, we're not listening to any of that kind of music. We're listening to the soul music, but in part because then the soul music, when he saw Earth, Wind, and Fire, is what made him realize, oh, here's who I am. Perhaps this tells a big story about my identity and who I can be, and it then becomes to some degree a point of connection with his family. I'm wondering if any of you would like to talk about or could talk about how soul music influences the African-American experience, and perhaps even vice versa, perhaps how the African-American experience influences soul music. And perhaps even connected to that, the other tool that Colman Domingo uses in this is storytelling, right? So he's using the music to tell these stories about his family and how important storytelling is to African-American culture.
Okay, well, I could definitely weigh in just a little bit on this one. As I said a little earlier, I definitely grew up in the 90s and like early 2000s for the most part. So for me, soul music with my older brother and sister, my older siblings, they were heavily into most of the music that you would hear in this show. But for me, I grew up more listening to R&B like Boyz II Men and those other groups. And I feel like I can kind of hear my mother, like sort of the way that she grew up with Earth, Wind, and Fire. As soon as Earth, Wind, and Fire came on, I did remember hearing a lot of that as a small child. And it had a huge effect because she was in the 70s. And there were a lot of things that were happening. Vietnam was ending and so many other things that my family was directly involved in. And it kind of drew a lot of those old memories of when I was a really small child and hearing that music. And then, of course, when I started to get a little bit older, I'm like, okay, well, this is my music now. Like I listen to this other stuff, but I imagine that this is how my little sister saw my music. So it's kind of fun to just see the generations go down and see what connects to each other for the most part. But I mean, yeah, it's fun to listen to, but I'm really happy that it actually made that big of an impact on the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
Tony's gonna keep saying stuff to try to make us feel old, but I don't receive that.
I'm not. No, I'm not that young.
I'm just kidding.
I'm old too.
I say that because I knew all the words to every song and sang along through every portion of each one of the parts in the show. Toward the very end of the show, there's a statement that I'll save so I don't spoil it for many people. But it is about how soul music can many times be a euphemism or even a double entendre for the representation of how that music affects you. And what I wrote down is that music is an embodied experience, especially when the music tells the story of all different aspects. I wrote other music, especially in Black culture, represents style, hope, dreams, love, family, relationships, mood, time, and place, right? The whole idea that Sunday was for gospel music, right? That's the time we listen to Leontine Price, and as Shameka said, get hallelujah, right? That is a representation of time and place. The reference to the quiet storm every night at 11 o'clock, Moments of Love came on and you knew it was time for the Quiet Storm, right? Music represents so many different aspects of just time and space and life. It is transcendental in Black culture. And it is an embodied experience. It's hard to hear a song that you love and not feel it some way, shape, or form, whether it is physically, mentally, or emotionally. And that's what I got from the show. You know, the use of music helped us know when and where we were and why we needed to be there at that moment.
I'll agree. I think that during the 70s and 80s, whenever our parents were playing this music, they were still very much hopeful, like Anitra said, and there was so much pride, and there was so much that piggybacked from rights and civil rights and power and empowering each other and just being resilient from everything that had come before us. So during that time, I remember my 6th grade graduation, the music that we played, and I went to a predominantly white elementary school, but the music that was played was very soulful and very empowering. And I just feel like it is, when I think of that time and that era, that's what I think about, even though it was a little bit after that time. I can remember watching music montages, and some of the music from the late 70s and the 80s are played during a time when they showed some of the things that's going on, like right now today uh, with protests and movements. So that's definitely what I think of during that time.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking, you know, music was such a critical part of the civil rights movement. It was so defining and so necessary for sharing messages, but also helping people feel and stay kind of committed, because it was exhausting, right? It was yeah, an incredibly difficult time, and so the music was a way in which people were able to, when you think of like keep your eyes on the prize, like the way to sort of keep people uplifted and going and connected as community. And you know, this story takes place in the between the late 70s to the early 90s, and we've got music that's really talking about identity and love and connection and really just sort of celebrating that. I think I really loved when JJ pulled out you know, the album was like, oh, look at how beautiful she is, and a beautiful big afro, and you know, just sort of really celebrating all the ways in which Black people were able to be celebrated, right? And even thinking back to that Earth, Wind, and Fire concert, and just thinking of these men coming out in these glittery costumes, and you know, just sort of just being fully yourself and being fully adored for all of that as well. I think was a really powerful construction that Colman used in this play.
I thought about how they most of the songs that were played really did celebrate Black love, like really did. And then towards the end, Pop said, "Love is love," and so I was able to make the connection between those two things.
Yeah, excellent, definitely. Well, I'm actually going to open up the conversation to our audience members. I do have, if they don't have questions, I've got more questions, but I figure I would go ahead and see if anybody has questions. So I'll use this time to remind you in the audience, if you would like to ask your question on video, just use the raise your hand function, which is either, if you've got the newest version of Zoom, is at the bottom, probably at the bottom of your screen. If you got the older version of Zoom, if you open up the participants area, again, the participants is at the bottom of your screen, you open that up, it'll open up above your chat, and then you can do your raise your hand there. Otherwise, if you prefer to not be seen on camera and you would like me to read your question, you can certainly add a question to the chat, and I'll be happy to do that for you. So while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to shift us a little bit to some more of the acting from Mr. Smith. And Tony, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned earlier that you, as you were kind of getting into this character and really the characters, there are some things that you could relate to in terms of your family, having some of the different characters reminding you of some different folks in your own family. What else was your inspiration, or how did you pull on that inspiration to create each of these characters, especially since they kind of pop in and out for brief periods of time. But I will say, for me as a viewer, I felt like, they were full characters. I kind of knew who they were, and I could feel them so deeply. So can you talk to us a little bit more about your process, your creative process in finding those characters?
Sure. Going into the families, especially mom, pop, and brother and sister, Avery and Rick, I did draw a lot from my family. My older sister is a lot like how I kind of portray Avery in this show, which is hilarious because she's not as she's not as outspoken as Avery is in the show, but only when it's with family. That's when she'll really let herself be herself. And that's when she will just, say anything that's on her mind. She would never say this stuff in public. But as far as the acting goes, and trying to get to the characters, I really tried to age them. It's like, okay, if this is how they are as teenagers, how do you think they would be as adults? And the things that were changing in the world, how would that probably impact them if this is the way they were as kids? And especially with JJ, because with JJ, he mentions that in the beginning of the show, struggling artist, mid-30s, living in New York City. That's one thing that I at least could kind of relate to, because I used to live in New York City as well. And I wasn't quite in my mid-30s yet, but it was something that was very hard to do. And I ended up moving back to Louisville, Kentucky, and I was very, very happy with that decision. But as far as dealing with aging and finances with my parents, I'm lucky enough to still have both of my parents. My mom and dad are both still alive. But the idea of, that terrible day when things do start to go that way, I have no idea how I'm going to react. I don't know. And I don't know how my older brother and sister are going to react. And so from that standpoint, I just kind of had to go back and just think, it's like, wow, how would these people really have to react to their parents getting older and having to deal with aging and dying? And it's something that I dread. It's something I think about. But at the same time, I just kind of had to speculate. It's like, how's this going to go? How's this going to go? And how would JJ do it? Especially with the character that kind of helped to create. I love what he's done with it. And especially, it's all in the lines, really. And it's, just the intention behind each line and what I'm doing. And Michael, I'm going to definitely give him a shout out. Michael Drury, the director, gave me so much material to work with, which was great. And he just kind of put me in different places, like, okay, well, what if it were like this? How would you feel if this were the situation for you? And I mean, I have to give him that. He was such a huge help for this. So I don't know if that really answered the question. I feel like I just rambled, but that's how I felt about it.
It did. It was great. I do have a follow-up question, which was, given the fact that this was your first one-man show and there's a ton of material to learn and also multiple characters to embody and music to sing, and I mean, you were doing everything except for magic perhaps, but creating it for ourselves. What did you find the most challenging or the most difficult aspect of the performance?
Honestly, it wasn't just the lines. I didn't think that was the most difficult part, even though there were a lot of them. The hardest part for me was actually just, in our times right now, we basically recorded this with almost no audience. So, and just as a live performer, I've done a little bit of stand-up comedy, but mostly I've just done like very much live performances with audiences, and having to do this, because I mean, doing film work's a lot different than this. This is almost like a strange hybrid of both, the way that we did it. And I was always just used to having, people to feed off of, having the energy coming from the audience. And granted, the lines were hard to learn because there were a lot of them, but yeah, just doing it in front of almost an empty theater, but doing it with as much energy as I could, and knowing that I'm not really going to get a lot back because this is basically to a camera. But just really trying to put myself in the world of the play was probably the hardest like really being in the moment. Because I mean, honestly, a lot of the plays that I've always done, you would get the laughs, you'd get applause, things like that, and be able to kind of feed off of it, and everyone's energy is there. But I do think that was probably the hardest aspect for me, just doing it to almost nobody. But yeah, that was probably the hardest part.
Yeah, it definitely makes a difference when you know that line landed the way that it was supposed to.
Yeah.
And you don't get that feedback when, the audience is not present.
Yeah, exactly.
When you deliver the line.
Yeah. And I mean, and this would be hard for a regular play, like with a full cast, So it's like this being the first one-person play I've ever done. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm the only one here. The only one here. All right, we're just gonna do it. We're gonna tell the story. That's it.
Maybe for the next one, Michael would be willing to like pipe in the audience people like they do in the NBA. When they like the fake sound.
It's fun. We were actually joking about that during rehearsal. I was like, how about we just put a bunch of like, fake faces on the chairs and add a laugh track. And
it is definitely I felt bad for all of the performers this year who've all been phenomenal, that you don't actually get to even just receive the energy from the audience as we were watching at home, because I know, like, I've thoroughly enjoyed everything. I thoroughly enjoyed your performance, and I'm like, oh, I'm so sad that you don't get to see me laugh and sing along or applaud and what have you. It's unfortunate, but know that, I think you nailed it. And Michael would tell you if you didn't, for sure.
There were definitely some times where I'm like, he needed to know that joke landed. Like he needed to know that we got it. We heard you. We got it.
We do have an audience question from Marcus Fisher. See if we can get him on the screen. He raised, oh yes, there he is. Oh, was there a hot second ago. Let's see. Hi, Marcus. Can you make sure?
Hey, there I am. Okay,
there you are.
Great conversation, everyone. I wanted to go back to something that Anitra brought up, which was the duality. You talked about dualities and identity. And one thing that struck me that I grew up with a lot was duality in Black and culture, I think is the way you phrased it. And where JJ grew up playing the violin, and then there was also Leontine Price played in the house. And I was that kid. I was the weird kid in a lot of aspects. We won't go into that. But I was the weird kid that used to, at the top of its ability, play classical music. And my mom was like, oh, that's great. My dad was like, oh, that's great. But, my friends weren't into that. But I also liked LL Cool J and all that kind of stuff too. So if you could talk about that part of our Black experience also of, you do have your soul music over there, but then he's growing up with this other type of music and culture. Can you talk about that?
Me? You want me to respond?
Yeah, go back. Yeah, please.
I appreciate that, Marcus, because I too was the kid that I don't know that I was necessarily inclined to it, but once I was introduced to it, I was like, oh yeah, this is cool. We can do that. And as a young child, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was a part of a very early program at the Conservatory of Music where I did what they call mini singers. So I was classically trained in music and went to high school and, played the flute, but I was also the drum major and the marching band. And I think that one of the aspirations that comes with this double consciousness of, being Black and American that W.E.B. Du Bois was mentioning, in that same piece, he talks about the talented 10th and the idea that there is, this group of people that is not just expected, but also naturally inclined to, in some ways, rise above. And I think that this concept is very controversial within the Black community, but that there is an expectation that this leveled of acculturation is an achievement that everyone can't make. And that is the reason that this dual identity, this consciousness split is Black and cultured are opposed, because only certain people will be able to achieve the acculturation that we find to be at a certain level. And I don't think that's true, but I think that it is difficult to break down some of those concepts that have been, that we've been conditioned to believe for any number of reasons, not the least of which go back to white supremacy and slavery, but that's a whole different conversation. And I think that just like this notion of the societal view of LGBTQ identity is shifting, the notion that being cultured is some kind of an other identity is also beginning to shift, but in different ways. And I look forward to the day where that they don't have to be dual identities, but I think that will take time and an intentionality that I'm not sure everyone is ready for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I remember that JJ's mother said to him, I think it was when they were on the back porch in the new moon, that she said, I want you to travel. I want you to explore and see other things and, explore that part of yourself, but also don't forget where you come from. And I didn't notice in this play that there was any obvious point where JJ had to engage in code switching, but that's also a very prevalent part of that sort of dual identity or multiple identities, and thinking about culture and like white supremacist culture and your own cultures, being able to figuring out how to navigate between those two worlds. And so I appreciate what you said, Anitra. I do hope that we get to a place where that doesn't have to be, right? We can really just fully accept and embrace each other as ourselves, and being able to have all of those beautiful parts of our identity that make us, who we uniquely are.
Yeah, and I think it was most prevalent for me in the moment where Rick's listening to the Isaac Brothers, Avery's listening to, I don't remember, but in my mind it's JJ Fad. And and JJ's like, but my Beethoven, and it's like all of these things can exist all at the same time and in the same family, in the same space, and they don't have to be opposing.
Right.
Agreed. So I see Robert is on the screen, but I don't know if you have a question, Robert. If you do, feel free to unmute yourself and join us. And Michael has joined us also on screen. Again, don't know if you have a question, but if you do, feel free to unmute. The funny thing about technology, you never really know what it's going to do. If you don't have questions, I don't see them unmuting. I'm curious, and anybody can answer this question. What do you think JJ was learning about himself by going through those basement items?
Okay, so yeah, I can just weigh in just a little bit. Yeah, I think a lot of what he was learning was the value of those memories that he had. Just going through this entire thing and how important those were to him. He probably didn't realize how important it was until he was going over those old memories and the music that triggered those memories. I kind of think that's what it was. And throughout the play, you start to see him really think a little bit more about, wow, those actually were really important times. I can't believe I just remembered all these things. And even his little aside stories about, the family picnics and the time that one of his cousins fought each other and pulled off a wig and all that. Like just little things like that. And then the gravity of everything hits once he realizes why he's there again. Because it's almost like he gets lost in the whole thing. He forgets he's there just to clean the house. And he's just going, that's the only reason he's there. And once you go over those records, you remember so many things about childhood. And with adult eyes, as he says in the play, you get to see how important that was. I think that's kind of, at least that's my take on it.
Shameka, you talked earlier about sort of the celebration of Black love, and I think when I think about him going through the basement, and just what you said, Tony, about like there was the one reason, right? There's he's having to clear things out for his parents, but then it's about to go visit them, knowing that at that time, at least knowing that his mother wasn't doing well, that it also reminded him, he talked about pulling that album and reminding him of, or reminding his parents of the love that they have for each other. And I think perhaps even celebrating love for himself, perhaps as he's thinking, going down memory lane, as you were talking about, Tony, celebrating Black love in all of its expansiveness. Well, we are almost out of time. I just sort of want to open the floor to any other final comments or observations about the show, about the story, about the acting, anything, anything you'd like to leave the audience with. We covered quite a breadth of topics, which was really great, and I appreciate your engagement.
I think one of the things that really, for me, kind of pulled it all together brilliantly was the hospital scene where Mom recognized that she couldn't get Pop to listen to what she was saying in conversation. And so she took him to a place that she knew he would understand without the communication. But also in that moment, the song choice was pretty poignant to me because that song, while started as a secular song, has also been co-opted into a gospel song, and again transcends the relationship and the representation of what music means in their life. It was just a brilliant moment, I think, in the show, of pulling together all of the different elements that we have seen up to that point be displayed without necessarily, be thrown in our face. Mm-hmm. And that moment was kind of where they all sat together. It was brilliant for me.
Shameka, I saw you nodding in agreement. Go ahead.
That entire scene was great for me. I love him pondering if maybe his dad Pops talking about the affair was actually him comparing death to an affair, and the person that she's cheating with to God, and saying, you know what, I'll leave you before you leave me. Again, we're really connecting Black love and the importance of it. And again, starting a process of grief in a different kind of way. That was brilliant for me. I was like, oh, you know what? You might be right. Love that.
Definitely. Well, Tony Smith, Anitra, Durand-Allen, Shameka Selsmore, thank you all so much for engaging in this conversation. I thought the play was beautiful. Tony, I thought your rendition was fantastic. Your performance was fabulous.
Thank you.
Yeah, well worth multiple watches, multiple views. And I appreciate Anitra and Shameka, your conversation today, and just being willing to be with us and help us kind of really dive a little bit deeper into the show, particularly during this time of COVID, when we don't get to be together and we're kind of all watching the show and, solid on our own in our own homes. It's so nice to be in community with one another to really process the impact a piece of theater can have on our lives. So I appreciate it. Michael, our producing artistic director, also says thank you. Shameka and Anitra, for your inspired insights and deep thoughts on the show. Thank you, Tony, for your brilliance and light. He so appreciates you all participating today, and thanks to all who attended today. Please do share the show with your friends and family. Get the word out. We would love more people to have an opportunity to witness Tony and Colman's brilliance and be enlightened and engaged and entertained along with the rest of us. So I hope you all continue to stay safe and well. Shameka, thank you for sharing about your losses. I'm very sorry to hear about that, but I really appreciate you being open with us and sharing your own learnings from that. I hope that you all remain healthy and well, and we look forward to seeing you all again. We've got 2 more shows coming up this season, True and I Profundus, but my hope is that perhaps next season we'll we'll be able to be in physical proximity to each other and community again. So thank you all and have a wonderful Martin Luther King holiday weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.